My name is Lucy Kingdon, and I'm a final year medical student at Swansea. I've created this talk to give an introduction to medical genetics for people that need to know a little bit about genetics, for example, medical students, but who don't necessarily have a background such as an A-level or a GCSE in biology. Before you could begin, if I could get you to fill in this quiz, it's just for my learning. If you could scan it or follow that link there, and take the quiz, and then there'll be another one at the end just to see how much you've taken in. So feel free to pause the video now and do this quiz. So what is DNA and what is it made of? DNA is in nearly every cell in your body. It carries all of the instructions for your development, your growth, and your reproduction. It's called a polymer, which means it's made of many, many monomer units, which are called nucleotides. Nucleotides consist of a phosphate, a sugar, and a base. The base can be 4 different types: A, C, G, or T. These sequences of the bases are how information is carried. For example, one particular sequence of bases could mean brown eyes, while another could mean blue eyes. These bases form very specific bonds with one another, and then the sugar and the phosphate groups form the backbone along the side. This forms a kind of ladder-like structure of DNA, which is then twisted around each other to make the double helix that is commonly known as DNA. This is then twisted very tightly into itself into chromosomes, which are those X-like structures. We inherit our DNA from our parents, so 50% from our mum and 50% from our dad. I find this picture of gummy bears quite useful as I'm a visual learner. So as you can see, a red parent and a white parent together make children that are half red and half white. Similarly, when the half red, half white child has children with a green bear, then they have children that are half green, quarter red, and quarter white. This is really useful for imagining and picturing how DNA is inherited. Your DNA is in the form of 23 pairs of chromosomes. So that's 23 pairs of those X-like structures. What is an allele? An allele is different forms of the same gene. You have one allele on each chromosome that correspond to each other. These are inherited from your parents. So one is going to be from your mum and one is going to be from your dad. They can be exactly the same allele, identical in every way, as you can see from the blue ones there. They're both a capital E. Or they can be different, such as the green ones, where there's one capital D and one little d. What is genotype and phenotype? Phenotype is the observed result of someone's genes. For example, them having blue eyes, them having brown eyes, them having a disease such as cystic fibrosis, or them having the absence of a disease. A genotype, on the other hand, is their actual genetic makeup, their sequence of bases, their genetic code. I've got a picture on the right-hand side of the screen of an example of a chain of bases, just to show you that it looks like nothing. We can't even understand it. It's just a string of letters. But it makes up really important genetic information that can code for eye color, disease, that kind of thing. This is a Punnett square. We use them to predict the probability of a child having particular genes. The parents we put on the top and on the left. So for example, the mother and the father. The 4 possible combinations of their genetics are then in the center. These are all combinations for those alleles. In this example, the father has the genotype capital B and lowercase b. He has the phenotype of brown eyes, so he has brown eyes. The mother has the genotype little b, and the phenotype of blue eyes. I'm going to introduce you to something called dominance. So this capital B allele is dominant. That means that you only need one of it to have the phenotype of brown eyes. Dominant means that this will always be expressed. If you ever have a capital B, you will always have brown eyes. In the opposite, the little b is recessive. This means that to have blue eyes, you need to have two little b alleles. They can only be expressed if there is no dominant allele. They can only be expressed if they are the only alleles that are. Now, I'm going to ask you guys a question. This mother and this father, what percentage of their children are going to have blue eyes? Feel free to pause. You can use pen and paper to try and work this out. I'll go on to the next slide and give you the answer now. The answer is 50%. Knowing that a capital B means that the child will always have brown eyes, there are only 50% of their children that will have blue eyes. Let's do another question and make it slightly harder. What percentage of this couple's children are going to be blue eyes? I'm going to give you a second to work this out. The next slide has the answer, and the answer is 0%. Because the father has two dominant genes, two dominant alleles, the children can never have blue eyes because the capital B, the dominant allele, is always going to override the little b, which in this case is for blue eyes. They will never have blue-eyed children. Okay, this is the last one of these Punnett squares. What percentage of this couple's children are going to have blue eyes? The mother has brown eyes, the father has brown eyes. How many of their children will have blue eyes? And the answer is 25%. 25% will have that double lowercase b, the two recessive alleles, and will therefore have blue eyes. Now, these questions might seem a little strange or peculiar, but actually they're really useful for us to be able to track a disease as it runs through the family. This is called a pedigree chart. It's a fancy word for a family tree that tracks a disease. The squares represent men, the circles represent women. If the shape is black, then it means that they have the disease. If the shape is white, they do not have the disease. So in this family tree, you can see that the disease does not ever skip a generation. If a child has the disease, then one of their parents has the disease. This is an autosomal dominant condition. It cannot skip generations because if you have the diseased allele, you will have the disease because it is dominant. Example of diseases that are autosomal dominant include Marfan syndrome and Huntington's disease. If your parent has the disease, then you might get the disease. An autosomal recessive condition is slightly different. It's a recessive allele. Therefore, you need two copies of this recessive allele to have the disease. I'd like you to focus on the family in the center with the parents 8 and 9. Neither of them have the disease as they're both white shapes. However, their child, 17, has the disease. What we can infer from this is that this is a recessive disease because it has skipped a generation, and that both the parents 8 and 9 have one recessive allele each that they have passed on to their child 17. We call 8 and 9 carriers because they carry the recessive allele, but they do not have the disease itself. Examples of diseases that are autosomal recessive include cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease. Remember, an autosomal recessive disease can skip generations. I'm going to talk to you now about codominance. This is where you have two alleles that are both dominant, but equally dominant with one another. This means that if somebody has both of these alleles, they are both simultaneously expressed. The best example of this is in blood group. There are 4 blood groups: A, B, AB, and O. Alleles A and B are co-dominant with one another, which is why the AB blood group exists. It's because that person has one A allele and one B allele. O, however, is recessive to both A and B. I wanted to draw your attention to this Punnett square, where the mother has a blood group A and the father has a blood group B. However, their children are blood groups AB, B, A, and O. This is quite an interesting and unusual combination, but it does come up. So be aware of co-dominance. I'm going to talk now about sex and how that is inherited. As I said before, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. This is what they actually look like under a microscope in our cells. So 23 pairs of these X's. 22 of these pairs are autosomes, which means they're chromosomes that carry information that has nothing to do with sex. It's all to do with how the body works, different organs, but nothing to do with sex in particular. However, there's one pair that is to do with sex. These are called, unsurprisingly, the sex chromosomes. Men have the chromosomes X and Y, while women have the chromosomes X and X. These chromosomes are the ones that have all the information about sexual reproduction and sexual characteristics. Sex is inherited in exactly the same way as other alleles. But please note that the father is the one that determines gender. The woman's eggs in her ovaries are all XX. However, the men's sperm in the testes are XY, meaning that some sperms carry X and some sperms carry Y. This is interesting to me because Henry VIII, famous King of England, blamed his wives for being unable to give him a son. However, if he'd known about genetics, he would have realized that it is the sperm that carry the X or the Y that determines the gender of children. Therefore, he was wrong to blame his wives. An X-linked condition is where the allele that carries the disease is carried on the X chromosome. Because women have two X chromosomes, they tend to be less affected by this, or they have a milder form of the disease. However, because men only have one X chromosome, if they inherit a diseased X chromosome, there is very little they can do, and they tend to have the disease. A father with an X-linked condition, I've used XA here to represent disease, passes this on to all of his daughters, this faulty chromosome or allele. However, he cannot pass it on to his sons because he gives them the Y chromosome that they need to be male. Similarly, a mother with an X-linked condition can pass it on to both her daughters and her sons, as you can see from this Punnett square here. Her daughters will be the same as her. They'll have one faulty allele and one normal allele. However, all of her sons will her sons that inherit the faulty allele will probably have the disease because obviously they don't have another X chromosome. Here is a pedigree chart with the X-linked recessive inheritance pattern. As you can see from this, the 3 people that have the disease are all men. There are no women that have the disease. This disease here is red-green color blindness. And as a real example, 7 to 10% of men have this, while only 1% of women. This is because women would need to inherit 2 of the faulty alleles, which is quite unusual. Remember that affected fathers cannot pass X-linked traits to their sons because the sons will inherit their Y chromosome, which is what makes them male. I'd like to thank you all so much for listening. Please scan this QR code and answer another quiz. It's much of the same questions, but I'm hoping that now that your score might be slightly higher now that I've taught you this. While you're taking the quiz, please feel free to refer back to this video as it should have all the answers you need to complete. So please scan that QR code now. And just to finish, here are my references about some of the pictures and the information I've used. Thank you so much for listening.